Well, hello everyone, welcome back. Can everyone hear me okay at the back of the room? Brilliant, thank you. So welcome back for this final session. I'm Catherine Clark and I'm really honoured to be chairing this last session of what's been a really special afternoon. So I'm Director of the IHR Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, and that continues the work of the Centre for Metropolitan History and continues Derek's legacy here at the IHR. I sadly didn't know Derek personally. I only met him once shortly after I joined the IHR in 2019. But as a medieval historian myself, with interests in place, towns and mapping, his work has been absolutely formative to my own research. So it's a real privilege to be part of this event and to have the role that I have at the IHR. So this session is titled Building Bridges, Making Connections in Urban Research. And I know that that image of the bridge is one that's very powerful, that means a lot to Derek's family, that meant a lot to Derek. I was really struck in many of people's thoughts and memories of Derek. That phrase, that image of the bridge and bridge building came up time and time again. Comments that Derek had a gift for building bridges between people, between places and cities, and between disciplines as well. So we're concluding the formal sessions today with a conversation that will move us again beyond history itself and explore connections with other disciplines. We're going to reflect on how Derek's work opened up those possibilities for exchange and collaboration, how it built bridges, but also what's going on right now in interdisciplinary urban research, and perhaps what we need or what we hope for in the future. We have two speakers working at the intersection between different disciplines and specialisms. And I'd also add that my own background was in English literature. I was a professor of English before I moved more recently to my role at the IHR. So these questions around interdisciplinarity and crossing those boundaries are really close to my heart. And actually talking to many people over coffee, I really have a sense of the very varied disciplinary backgrounds that people are here from today, which I think really speaks to the reach and the range and the richness of Derek's work. So I will introduce our first speaker, who I'm sure all of you know, Jim Galloway, who is a historian with particular interests in the environmental and economic history of the Middle Ages. As you'll know, he worked closely with Derek on the Feeding the City projects on relationships between medieval London and the agrarian economy of southern England. He co-edited with Matthew Davies the 2012 collection of essays in honour of Derek, and a lot of his recent and current work relates to the broader environments and hinterlands of London, including the Thames and the Thames estuary. So, Jim, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much. This will really be a few reflections on Derek's interdisciplinary interests and influence, particularly in relation to historical geography and environmental history. Based on my personal experience of working with Derek and reading his published works, and they certainly don't amount to any sort of systematic overview. Well, I was lucky enough to work with Derek for over 12 years, between September 1988 and early 2001, when he was director of the CMH and I was a researcher and later a co-director on a series of research projects investigating medieval London's hinterland and the city's role within regional and national economies. Subsequently, he was a vital source of support and advice when I was developing other projects at the National Maritime Museum in 2006, and back at the CMH, then under Matthew's leadership between 2008 and 2010. I had first heard Derek speak back in 1981, when I was an astonishingly young postgraduate student. The occasion was a past and present conference commemorating the 600th anniversary of the Peasants' Revolt, and Derek spoke on the disturbances in Winchester during 1381 and how they seemed to reflect trade rivalries and institutional tensions rather than a popular uprising. I got the impression of a serious, intense scholar, perhaps even of a certain austerity of character. When I arrived at the CMH 7 years later, I found that my impression was partly right. Here was an extraordinarily gifted and hard-working historian who believed firmly in the importance of history, and especially of primary documentary research. But on the other hand, I had been deeply mistaken, in that far from being austere, Derek was open, welcoming, friendly, intellectually generous, and possessed of a great sense of humour. He was also, I soon discovered, fascinated by maps and committed to a spatial approach to historical problems. This was manifest in his detailed studies of topography in Winchester and London, where reconstructing the physical arrangement of a city was a key way to understand its economic and social history. But also in his conviction that cities, and especially metropolises, could not be understood on their own, but needed to be seen in their wider context, as part of networks of urban settlements, and in relation to their rural hinterlands, the areas which fed them and supplied them with the other necessities of life. These interests and research priorities naturally led Derek into close relations with historical geographers, notably Bruce Campbell of the Queen's University Belfast, with whom Derek devised and co-directed the Feeding the City projects, and with the London-based geographers Richard Dennis and David Green, who at various dates were co-conveners of the Metropolitan History Seminar and members of the CMH Advisory Committee. Feeding the City was one of the inaugural CMH projects, commencing in September 1988. It investigated London's impact on its agricultural hinterland and the supply systems which linked producers and consumers. It combined a reconstruction of the agrarian landscape and patterns of land use, drawing on Bruce Campbell's expertise, with Derek's profound insights into medieval London's economy and society, and the role played by London within wider commercial networks. The project researchers consisted of one historical geographer, me, and one medieval historian, Margaret Murphy, who had just completed a PhD in Trinity College Dublin. We took the interdisciplinarity a stage further by marrying in 1991. And in fact, we had our wedding reception in the IHR common room, which was a very memorable day. Derek ensured that the advisors to the project, both formal and informal, were all scholars to whom space and map data were important or crucial ways of visualizing and interpreting the medieval economy. And we benefited greatly from the experience and friendship of scholars like Harold Fox, Richard Britnell, Larry Epstein, Chris Dyer, Marianne Kowaleski, and John Langdon. As researchers, Margaret and I also benefited enormously from Derek's practical knowledge of the counties around London, gained from his walks and first-hand observation of the landscape, as well as from his profound historical knowledge. He had boundless enthusiasm for the research, and we all spent many happy hours around the big project wall map, musing over the latest manner to be added to the database, or on some striking new information about legume yields in North Kent in the early 14th century. The co-authored A Medieval Capital and Its Grain Supply, which emerged from the project, was published in the Institute of British Geographers' Historical Geography Research Series. It has influenced much subsequent work on towns and their hinterlands, not least recent studies of Irish medieval towns, including a major study of the medieval Dublin region, co-authored by Margaret with the archaeologist Michael Potterton. Derek subsequently took the study of London's food supply further in his papers on crisis management over the period 1250 to 1500, where Feeding the City had attempted to reconstruct the operation of a system in normal times. Derek now looked at that system under stress, at the impact of harvest and distribution failures, the role of environmental shocks, such as the major volcanic eruption which seems to have provoked the subsistence crisis of 1258 to 9. The issue of fuel supply was also addressed during both the Feeding the City and Market Networks projects, and was of particular interest to Derek, both from the point of view of energy history and provisioning the city, but also in practical terms. As we all know, Derek was a very practical man. He was interested in materials, he was interested in trees, he was interested in wood and what people used it for. Our analyses of the costs of production and transport of wood fuels in the London hinterland and the documented activities of the city's woodmongers indicated how constrained medieval London's wood fuel supply was by the availability of water transport, and thus how intensely the city bore upon the relatively restricted zones of woodland in Surrey and Middlesex and along the axis of the Thames. They also helped to explain the early adoption of mined coal in London, shipped from northeast England. The co-authored paper which summarised these findings appeared in the Economic History Review in 1996. It's been widely cited by economic and urban historians, by scholars concerned with energy supply and history, and with the nature and timing of energy transitions, and by those with an interest in the management and exploitation of woodlands in the past, and in environmental history more generally. Indeed, Derek's work, both sole-authored and collaborative, has become increasingly influential within environmental history, rapidly developing sub-discipline which deals with the interactions of humankind and the natural world in the past. An overview of the state of medieval urban environmental history published in 2013 by Roberta Magnuson referenced 5 of Derek's solo publications and 4 more books and papers authored by members of the Feeding the City team or other CMH-based projects. In fact, around 10% of the references in that review work cite the works of Keene, or what we might call the Keene School. From the Winchester period onwards, Derek was interested in the ways in which cities managed their waste products and sourced and regulated supplies of fresh water. His 2001 paper, Issues of Water in Medieval London, looked at the multifaceted relationship between London and water, including the city's intimate engagement with the River Thames. Derek saw this as forming the intersection between institutions, technology, and the natural environment. This paper has influenced many subsequent studies, including my own investigations of the Thames fisheries and of storm flooding around the Thames estuary in the later Middle Ages. Derek and other scholars, notably the environmental historian Richard Hoffman, also looked at the way in which the London hinterland studies might contribute to understanding the so-called urban metabolism or ecological footprint of cities in the past, the environmental impact of cities in terms of their consumption of materials, and the reorganization of space and remodeling of ecosystems which facilitated that consumption, and in the generation of waste products, both the noxious byproducts of urban industry, but also the potentially or actually recyclable waste resulting from food processing and consumption. The journal Regional Environmental Change published a special issue on the history of the urban environmental imprint in 2012, to which Derek contributed. His paper, Medieval London and its Supply Hinterlands, brilliantly summarised the work done at the CMH and elsewhere since the 1980s, but it also ranged much further, locating the London hinterland experience within its wider contexts, temporal, spatial, and environmental. It was thus classic Keene, and there can be no higher praise. In conclusion then, as far as building bridges goes, Derek was instinctively interdisciplinary. He didn't care about what you had studied, what discipline you had a degree. He was interested in what you could contribute, what different angle you might be able to bring to the study of metropolitan history. His interests knew no boundaries, and it was a pleasure and a privilege to accompany him on a small part of his great intellectual journey.
So much for those reflections, Jim, and it really strikes me, so many of those inherently interdisciplinary areas, environmental history, water history, blue humanities, we might call it now, energy history, histories of waste. Those are only becoming more important and urgent in historical studies, and thinking about the present as well. And Derek's work, the work of Derek and his collaborators, so formative, such underpinnings for much of our thinking in those areas. Thank you. Our second speaker in this session is Kate Weikert, who is Senior Lecturer in Early Medieval European History at the University of Winchester, where she's also recently become Deputy Head of the School of History and Archaeology. And Kate's background before history, or alongside history, is in archaeology, which I'm sure she's going to mention as she speaks to us today. Her recent monograph, Authority, Space and Gender in the Norman Conquest Era, was shortlisted for the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion, a really great example of her work crossing disciplinary boundaries. She's currently developing a really exciting interdisciplinary research project on medieval Winchester, very much building on the work of Derek Keene and others in the city. And actually, I've just been struck by another interesting connection, which is we've talked today about how Derek was a maker and a craftsman, as well as a scholar. We saw that beautiful photo of him with his saw. And I've been really struck by how, Kate, you're bringing different kinds of making into your historical research of creative practice and creative writing alongside traditional archival research. So that's another lovely resonance, I think. I'll hand over to you next.
How's this for hearing in the back? Good? Thank you. I'm actually quite unfortunate that as a scholar I never got the chance to work with Professor Keene. I came into academia actually after his retirement, so I've not met him, I've not had the joy to work with him. And I think that I'm having some regret about this now, because his work, his communities sounds so generous and so collaborative and so imagination filled, which I think is an absolutely lovely way to be a scholar, the kind of scholars and scholarship that would be nice to have in the world. So I'm here to speak about history and archaeology in the spirit of these great projects that Professor Keene had, and how we can use these interdisciplinary approaches to forge new paths in research. It is a slightly terrifying task to say here are some directions forward, but hopefully taking some time to reflect on my own practice, my own research as well, and the Winchester-based, particularly the Winchester-based research that myself and a colleague are doing, in terms of thinking about how we might move forward in interdisciplinary ways. So one work, obviously two works that we've been very heavily influenced by is the Magisterial Winchester series, which I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with. So the critical edition of the Winton Doomsday, you see illustrated behind me, as well as Professor Keene's Survey Volume 2. We've talked a lot about London today, but any earlier central medievalists would be happy to point out that Winchester was very important as well. And anyone who's familiar with Professor Keene's work knows that too. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm positive. But these monumental works have really allowed us to shed new light on the past in different ways. And it's a very sort of inspired, imaginative way that we might be able to think about these intersections between people, place, and object. And it allows us to tell, I think, some stories about people in Winchester and people of Winchester that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So these works, in combination with the really extensive excavation records in Winchester, from the 1960s, 70s onto the ongoing work that's being done through City County Council today, give us enormous insight to the city, to the day-to-day life of people in Winchester in this period, and then maybe what we can do with this extensive record. Sue Nightingale, the late Sue Nightingale, for example, in her posthumous PhD, which I think was awarded in 2018 or 19, was working on mapping artifacts, small finds, into locations, into streets in Winchester to build this picture of everyday life. And as Catherine mentioned, my colleague Ryan Lavelle and I are trying to think creatively and to continue this sort of work in mapping people, objects, places, and time in central medieval Winchester. Thinking imaginatively, I think, as Professor Hardy mentioned earlier as well, and how we can recreate, how we can create, and how we can be creative about these pasts to find new ways to forge these stories. I very much myself, like to think about seeing the small to try to think about the big, is something that's come up over and over within these sessions today. I'm very interested in lived experiences and how we can lean on both disciplines of history and archaeology to think about this. So approaches like object experience, object biography, of course prosopography, which was mentioned earlier today as well. So I think this is where we can look at some trends, some topography, some excavations, some objects to illuminate lives and to see the past in multidisciplinary ways. So I'm going to use a few examples of how I think we might think through this. We're using Winchester as the example. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the people of Gare Street in Winchester. This is modern Gar and Trafalgar Streets for anyone who's familiar with the modern city of Winchester. In 1110 and 48, Gare Street was a smallish street in the southwest of the city. It was just below the new Norman castle, which had been planted there just after the Norman conquest. It was also one of the cheapest places in the city. By frontage value, it had the lowest average value that we can see in the Winton Doomsday. And it was also one of the last to be settled after the Norman period, even after the implantation of the castle. Now within the street, one interesting person we can talk about here is Link de Leer, who held property on the street in 1065. And here I'm drawing on work on Link, such as from myself, like Chris Lewis, and the late Duncan Provert. By dint of the Great Doomsday Book, we can say that Link had a series of rural estates across Hampshire, Berkshire, Surrey, Buckinghamshire, and Wiltshire, as well as his property on Gare Street. His wife held an additional estate in Berkshire, and the two of them had 5 sons. So with land holding of this scale, centralized around this border of Hampshire, Berkshire, and Wiltshire, Link was a thane of some standing. His name, Link de Leer, was interpreted by Duncan Provert as Link the Dealer, and his properties in Winchester gave him access to both the court and the markets that were there. It would have kept him tapped into the activities in all of these spheres, these multiple communities that one of the previous speakers has mentioned. His property on Gar Street was not an expensive holding. He paid 30 pence for it, but it was at that property value, one of the 3 most valuable on that street. As the dealer, he might have been some kind of a procurer of some variety, acting on behalf of or with the royal court in Winchester. His rural estate at Fackham Netherton, which is in northwest Hampshire, was a very large and very valuable one, though. It was worth £13 in Lake's day. And according to Doomsday, it had land for 12 ploughs, a village of up to 37 households. So that's 21 villagers, 12 smallholders, and 4 enslaved households. Fackham Netherton, of course, has also been extensively excavated and published by John Fairbrother. Many of you may be familiar with this excavation as well. Link died by 1086, we know that much. We don't know how he died. It could have very easily been natural causes or old age. His wife and his sons had made it through the conquest, but they were in somewhat diminished circumstances. They had holdings of 3 burgates in Bedfordshire, held from her own dower, and this was worth 3 shillings. Lake's property on Gare Street we can't unfortunately trace into the next. Roger the Poitevin received the estate at Fackham Netherton after the conquest, and Roger also held 6 houses in Winchester, but these were not the ones on Gare Street. And at this point, Link, his unnamed wife, and unnamed 5 sons pass out of recorded history. So to some degree, Lake's life told to us by Great and Winton Doomsday, as well as these excavations, can exemplify the life of a thane in the early to mid-11th century, and particularly lives that get lost to us through lack of documentation. Lake is essentially a microcosm. He can be sort of the seed of the experience of how we can think about thanes of Edward the Confessor in the pre- and post-conquest period. With no records of him other than around the Doomsday and the excavations, we can also archaeologically state that the estate at Fackham Netherton was a very wealthy one. It was one that had been formerly held by royal relatives in the late 10th century. With no other noted family connections either, other than his wife and sons, we might extrapolate that Link was a rising man, a new man in the 11th century. And to it, you see the classic archaeological markers at Fackham Netherton, such as a new system of boundaries and access points at Fackham, possibly founding a church there as well, so exemplifying this man rising in his status at this time. He was surely peripatetic. He surely moved between his estates with his family, living both an urban and a rural life, traveling between estates, and perhaps particularly the ones clustered around the border of northwest Hampshire, and then also into Winchester, where he might have dealt with the royal courts. He didn't necessarily die in battle, or any of the upheavals that followed 1066. But the family's status was lowered post-conquest, we can see this. So this gives us this idea of this shift in society, this fall from wealth. Domesday, the great Domesday book, notes that the estate that Lang's widow and son still held, there were no ploughs at the estate. And whilst in 1065 it was worth 20 shillings, in 1085 it was only worth 3. Lang's life and work brings up another aspect of thinking small, and this is something I found really quite amusing, the idea of making, too, that Catherine mentioned. What were people doing in Winchester in the post-conquest era? So in this Garter Street, in just one street, we have a number of different occupations throughout the periods of the surveys. A park keeper, ladder maker, Lang the dealer, 3 priests and 2 clerics, a sword maker, tailor, dispenser, ragman, palmer, butler, saddler, and brewer. This is quite a wide stretch, isn't it? There's no real concentration of trades that we see on this street, perhaps, but this is also where topography can become important. So, for example, the number of clerical men really stand out here. And Garter Street had 2 parish churches by the mid-12th century, St. Martin and St. Andrew. So perhaps some of these men were the parish priests. And some of these men who are called clerics rather than priests, too, might be in service to the administration of either the bishopric or the royal court, and possibly both. As Professor Keene and Professor Biddle points out, the palmer that we see in 1110, Anne's kettle, probably represents someone who had gone on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, so holy enough to be associated with the idea of being a palmer, bringing back a palm leaf to represent the spiritual journey. And he was someone who would have been wealthy enough to have undertaken this journey, although his property on Garter Street was one of the lowest in value. But again, here's where topography comes in handy, as been pointed out. Perhaps he chose this place because of its proximity to the Easter Guild, which is also listed in the 1110 survey in the area. And there are also strong links to the Easter liturgy in these areas, with the St. James Parish Church a stop on the Palm Sunday progression. And what I think also is what's very fun in these examples of occupation, too, is something that we can have a little fun with here. We have an example of both a tailor and a ragman living on the street in 1110. The only tailor, the only maker of clothes in Winchester in 1110, was 2 doors down from the only ragman in Winchester. As ragmen dealt in second-hand clothes, here we've got scope to imagine a second-hand business arrangement, maybe, a moment where goods go off a primary market into a secondary one. I think someone mentioned the gray markets earlier today as well, for customers of lower economic status. These professions also give us a sense of lost materiality, objects that don't archaeologically remain in the record, but can be wonderfully recreated through material studies such as these, as well as areas like experimental archaeology, which I think holds great scope for future studies. One other area I'd like to mention as well, and it's been quite pleasing to hear this mentioned a number of times today, is the idea of women in the past. I think it was Professor Liddy who mentioned, and I was desperately trying to scribble this down, and I don't have it exactly right, but questioning categories of ordinariness when it rejects the experience of women or other people, as it were, within urban experiences. Of course, Professor Keene has the wonderful article on women in descent of property using these materials as well. And I think that this kind of work is one area where we can think about bringing that diversity into the past that we know at places are missing within our historical record, as in our secondary or historiography. There was, of course, a lot more diversity in urban spaces as what we may traditionally think. These composite views, these many spheres of communities, as Professor Liddy pointed out, these intersecting communities. And we start to see this in some new works that are pushing these boundaries into diversifying the past, into thinking through urban studies. So, for example, Dr. Dean Irwin's work, thinking about medieval Jewish communities as a part, again, of these multiple communities, not a separate sphere, but a community that is a part of urban communities. And I think, too, this is one place where I can speak into my own research about thinking about women and gender in the past as well. Within Winton Domesday and related excavation records, we have one Constance Mountowit. This was the wife of William Pont de l'Arche, who was the chamberlain of the royal treasury at Winchester, the castellan at Portchester Castle, and himself one of the men who undertook the 1110 survey. Professor Professor Keene's work in Winchester and very Cunliffe's excavations at Portchester can give us a better picture, I think, of the life of a medieval gentrywoman in the city of Winchester and the castle at Portchester, pulling together archaeology, buildings history, and just your archival history, the sense of the past. Putting this together, Constance Madwood probably grew up in Winchester in the Hampshire estates of her own father. And the period after her marriage to Pontefract is also the period when a great deal of Portchester Castle was constructed, with new parts of the keep and new parts of the inner bailey. As the lady of the house, she probably gave valuable input to design and decor to some area of the castle's household rooms, and also likely played important administrative roles to the castle household. And this includes during the anarchy period in which Portchester saw action in 1143, when Constance was demonstrably at Portchester Castle during the activity. So these combinations of resources, I think, taken together, not held separately, I think can really help understand medieval experiences. So at the individual level, but also to forge forth, to try to put forth these larger pictures of the past, of these people that we may not have great material or written records. So my brief comments here have really only been a snapshot of a few things, a few ideas, a few people on one street, and maybe some ways where we can think differently, think creatively, in combining these sources. I think actually Jim said it really well. It doesn't matter what discipline you are, it's what you bring to this, what can be offered. And I think working in the early Middle Ages, you often see that very lovely sense of this is evidence, let's think about it. It doesn't necessarily matter what discipline it comes from. And I think there's great opportunity within Winchester, the Winton Doomsday, the excavations, past, current, ongoing, and future. And just for example, the whole of Winton Doomsday accounts for more than 800 individual plots within the city, which to my mind is an opportunity for more than 800 stories of people of Winchester in the Conquest era. So these are just a few. But thanks to the great work of Professor Keene, we have the opportunities to tell these stories now.
Thank you so much, Kate. That feels like such a fitting place to draw our presentations to an end with those Winchester micro-histories and individual lives, really reminding us what's at stake, what we can recover through this kind of urban historical research that we're all engaged in, following Derek's example. Now, we are a little bit tight for time at this point. No, it's not. It's a short session. I wonder, do we have time, Justin, for a couple of questions? Hopefully, yeah. Okay. So questions and comments, yeah, we can see on there.
Thank you. I have a question for Jim. Am I speaking into this properly?
Yes.
Thank you. Jim, I was really interested in your comment about the Keene school. And I must admit, it stopped me listening to what you were saying, because I started thinking about the Keene school and what would be on the curriculum in the Keene school. And obviously, walking very fast, motion in space would be on the curriculum. Clearly, as you indicated, space going out flatwards, horizontally, as far as Peterborough or wherever would be on it, but also going vertically up for his tall buildings would be on the curriculum. And then I thought, yes, but cooking would be on the curriculum, because Derek was extremely good at cooking. And trendy restaurants in Islington would be on the curriculum. And I remember once receiving a short lecture from Derek on trendy architects' design magazines. I think design and observation of what's going on around us at the moment, just as much as what was going on 1,000 years ago, would be on the curriculum. So I was wondering about your thoughts of the Keene School.
Well, I think you've said it as well as anybody could. I mean, Derek's interests were so broad and so all-encompassing that a Keene school really would be a school of the universe in a sense. But yeah, the ideas of space, I think, were very important to Derek, and they certainly recur in all sorts of different contexts. So I think a spatial element is a key to what I understand by Derek's approach to history. add to the curriculum, I think, in other ways. I mean, the thing that always struck me about Derek was just how much he loved research and how much he loved new results. I remember sometimes in the CMH, perhaps Derek had been having a difficult day trying to get some of these grants together, dealing with university bureaucracy or anything, and he'd come in looking really tired and, a bit ground down. But immediately he'd come in and say, "Any new results?" And if there was something new that had come up from Feeding the City or one of the other project's results, something we could sit down and talk about and think about in all its multifarious aspects, he would become alive again. He would be, all the fatigue would be gone. He would be back in the zone. That's sort of the key to the Keene School. I think it's just enthusiasm, love for history, love for research.
And I should add, enjoying the city, exploring the city, using the city, and especially drinking the wine of the city.
Do you know what, I think that's where we'll probably end the discussion. It's a perfect segue, a perfect link to the wine. I have got a few words to squeeze in first. But I think that idea of the Derek Keene School and imagining that and all the different facets of it is a lovely way to conclude our sessions. So will you join me in thanking our two speakers, Jim and Kate, again. And before we do move out to the reception, I think I have too many microphones here. I do have a few very brief closing remarks. We're moving ahead to the final item on your programme. So I want to conclude first of all by thanking all the speakers today. It's been wonderful for me as a medievalist interested in towns and place to hear your reflections on particular research and really challenging questions and provocations that I'm going to take away and think about, but much more than that, hearing your reflections on Derek and how he's inspired you, how he's shaped your work, hearing your personal memories of Derek. That has been really very special. So can we thank all of our speakers again, please? I'd also like to thank my colleague Justin Colson, who you heard from at the beginning of the afternoon, for all his hard work organising this event and the help of colleagues across the Institute and the School of Advanced Study, especially Gemma Dormer. And especially, of course, I'd like to thank Derek's family for all your support and your generosity and your involvement in putting this event together right from the very first ideas. So just a few further words before we move to our reception and a very special toast to Derek that will be introduced by our IHR Director, Claire Langhammer. So I'm going to keep it brief. So again, I'd like to say what a privilege it is to be part of the continuation of Derek's legacy with the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community here at the IHR. With the appointment of Justin just earlier this year and various new initiatives, we're making sure that we continue to champion urban, metropolitan history and especially London history here in the Institute. We launched our inaugural IHR London Summer School back in July, a wonderful week of lectures, seminars, field visits, archive trips. It was a real success and we're looking forward to running that again next year. The week also included our first annual Derek Keene lecture on London history. This first lecture was given brilliantly and very fittingly by Derek's friend and colleague who you've heard from today, Vanessa Harding. In 2023, the theme of the IHR London Summer School will be Secret Histories, and I'm delighted to say that the Derek Keene lecture will be given next year by Stefan Dickers, Special Collections and Archives Manager at the Bishopsgate Institute. Some of you may know Stefan. He's an incredibly charismatic and fascinating speaker who will take us, I'm sure, into some fascinating journeys into the Bishopsgate archives. So really something to look forward to. And I'm sure that lecture will be a highlight of the IHR's annual programme. In autumn 2023, will be launching a new IHR MA programme in history, place and community. It's a major endeavour right across the Institute, but centred on expertise and networks in the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, and of course, very much grounded in Derek's own interests. Urban history and London history are certainly going to feature very centrally, and I love the idea of lots more walking seminars as well, so we'll try to get those firmly embedded in the programme. And finally, I wanted to speak to you about another way that we want to carry forward Derek's legacy here at the IHR. We know that many of you have already given generously in memory of Derek, and those funds have been passed to the IHR very kindly by the Keene family. Thank you. Supporting emerging and future historians of all backgrounds was always close to Derek's heart. We've heard about that from several speakers already today. And we will use those gifts to help support the next generation of historians through initiatives such as London Summer School bursaries or towards studentships on our MA History, Place and Community. In conjunction with Derek's family, we've set up a page on the IHR website for anyone wanting to give in Derek's memory. There's a link in your programme today, or you can find details on the IHR website. Just go to the Support Us section. All of us at the IHR would like to thank Derek's family for all your support. Thank you. And thank you for helping us to continue Derek's legacy in this way. Thank you. And now we're going to go through and raise a glass to Derek, so do join us.